Good morning, everyone. My name is Mike Hickey. I'm the interim dean here at UNH Manchester, and it's really an honor for this college to be sponsoring this forum in conjunction with Americans for Peace, Prosperity, and Security. It's an honor as well to have Senator Rubio with us this morning. I should note that UNH Manchester is one of 7 colleges of the University of New Hampshire. We offer over 30 academic programs. We're largely a commuter college. And this past fall, we introduced an important new program on homeland security. So we have an appreciation for the wide range of issues that the Senator, as a candidate, is discussing with Americans today. Without further ado, let me introduce the Honorable Regina Birdsell. Senator Birdsell represents Senate District 19, and she's a member of New Hampshire APS. So welcome, Regina.
Good morning. Like Mike said, my name is Regina Birdsell, and as a member of the advisory board of the New Hampshire chapter of Americans for Peace, Prosperity, and Security, APS for short, I'm pleased to welcome you to our 8th Forum on National Security and Foreign Policy here in New Hampshire. In total, this will be our 27th National Security Forum that APS has hosted in the early voting states, and we will continue to host these forums right up through the primary as we work to raise the level of debate that this state and this country regarding the daunting challenges that our next commander-in-chief will face the day he or she takes office. Given the threats of our nation, we believe an open and substantive dialogue between voters and candidates for president is a vital part of the upcoming elections. Our goal today is to advance this dialogue with conversation with our guest, Senator Marco Rubio, about how he believes our national security and foreign policy challenges should be addressed. But before we get started, I want to thank Mike Hickey and the University of New Hampshire for graciously agreeing to host this forum, and the hard work and professionalism of Mike's staff and entire UNH Manchester team. I'd also like to draw your attention to the pens and papers that are on your seats please take the opportunity to write down any questions that you may have for the Senator, and he will address those questions during the Q&A of the forum. A couple of things, please make sure they're legible, please identify yourself, and make sure you put your hometown down there. And please keep your questions related to foreign policy and national security. We don't want to have any other questions about other candidates. So and when you're done, please pass your cards down to the end of the row, and a member of the APS team will take the questions from you. Today's guest, Senator Marco Rubio, is passionate about restoring the American dream because he's lived it himself. The son of Cuban immigrants whose lives were changed by America, Marco was raised to believe that all things are possible in this country. Carrying this with him, he served his home community of West Miami as a city commissioner before becoming a member of the House of Representatives in 2000 and eventually becoming the Speaker of the House in 2007. Three years later, in a remarkable come-from-behind story, Marco was elected to the U.S. Senate on the promise of bringing his passion for reform and optimistic conservative ideas to Washington. He has since become a leading opponent of the Washington's establishment's big government vision for America. In the Senate, he has dedicated himself to leading a bold offensive to restore the American dream through innovative 21st century conservative ideas. He has proposed reforms to our nation's anti-poverty efforts, tax code, regulatory policies, higher education system, vital senior safety programs, and national security. All of Marco's efforts have been aimed at helping everyday Americans achieve their own version of the American dream. He believes in a smart, limited government approach. We can revive the American dream and bringing it and reaching everyone, and usher in a new American century. Marco announced his run for president on April 13th, 2015. And it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce today's guest, Senator Marco Rubio.
I'm going to be very brief in my statements. I want to reserve the time to answer your questions and the questions of our moderator, other than to say that of all the issues before our country, when it comes to electing a president, national security is by far the most important one. Commander-in-Chief is the most important title that any president holds. There's only one Commander-in-Chief, and that their obligation is to keep us safe. One of the things that motivates me in this race is that I believe our current Commander-in-Chief is not doing that job well. That America, in the face of growing global threats, has grown less capable in its military due to defense cuts, due to the erosion of our intelligence programs, and due to the reputational damage that America has suffered at the hands of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy. It is one of the things that motivates me in this race because I know the world is a safer and a better place when America is the strongest military and the strongest power on the planet. And I will work every day as president to ensure that we remain that and more. So I look forward to answering the questions that are going to be asked here today about these important issues. Because in the end, there is no more important job of a president than to keep America safe. And when I'm president of the United States, I will work every single day to keep you, your families, and this great country safe. So thank you for having me today.
Hey guys, I'm Paul Steinhauser. I am the moderator today. I'm the political director and an anchor at NH1 News, WBIN TV, and somebody who's questioned Marco Rubio, Senator Rubio, a lot on the campaign trail. We are the media partner for APPS and for this great series, and we've been excited to do this. It has been a terrific series. This has got to be probably the largest crowd, though, to date. So it's exciting. We're less than 3 weeks away from the primary. And if you need any more another example of how important these issues are, take a look at the latest polling here in New Hampshire that just came out this week. Among Republican primary voters, those likely to vote, the #1 issue, foreign policy, national security, battling terrorism, by far. And that's why these forums are so important. Just one other note, this is being live streamed right now on our website, nh1.com, and this whole forum will be broadcast on WBIN TV at 1 o'clock this afternoon. So let me get that paperwork out of the way, and let's jump right into it. And I want to ask, the first question is going to come from Mike Rogers, the former congressman from Michigan. He is the honorary chairman of APPS, and it plays right off the news of the day because we saw this news out of London, British inquiry saying that Vladimir Putin most likely probably ordered the poisoning of that KGB spy, the ex-spy who was in London at the time. And Chairman Rogers wants to know how you would reassert the U.S. and how you would kind of stymie Vladimir Putin if you were in the White House.
Yeah, well, first, it begins by having a commander-in-chief that recognizes the true nature of Vladimir Putin. In fact, I have for months, to some criticism, described him as a gangster and an organized crime figure, even though I acknowledge that we're going to have to deal with him because between the United States and Russia, we possess about 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So you can't ignore that, and that reality will remain in place, and so we will have to have a continued dialogue with the Russian government, irrespective of who heads it. And our quarrel, by the way, is not with the Russian people, but Vladimir Putin is a gangster. He has ordered the death of people, and I think you see the Brits now have basically confirmed that in the case of this one individual, Litvinenko. But we also know this in the case of an apartment building that blew up in Russia that's every reason to believe Putin was behind to create a pretext, to blame it on Chechens, to give him an excuse to go in there. We've seen what he's done in Ukraine, where instead of sending in regular troops from the Russian army, he has, which would have been wrong as well, he's actually disguised their identity, but nevertheless sent them in to protect the pro-Russian militias and rebel groups that are on the ground. We've seen the annexation of Crimea in violation of all international norms. We've seen his incursion into Georgia in 2007, 2006, which also violates all norms. We see his sponsorship of pro-Russian separatist groups in multiple countries. We see the constant military testing of the NATO alliance, particularly when it comes to the Baltic states. So the first thing we must do is reinvigorate NATO. NATO, and for a number of years, seemed to lose its purpose. It was largely a coalition that was asked to participate in the projects and in the issues going on in the Middle East, and so lost some of its focus on territorial defense. So many of our NATO allies saw a significant erosion in their ability to protect their territory. because the notion of a Russian or foreign incursion into their homeland seemed far-fetched. Not anymore. And so it is important for us to reinvigorate NATO, particularly in its capability to defend itself from territorial incursions. And of course, you'll see a strong commitment on my part to do that. The other is the repositioning of a missile defense shield. It is critical not just because of Russia, but primarily because of Iran, because of its ballistic missile capability. And we've got to be able to protect both the mainland of the United States, but also help our allies in Europe protect themselves from any sort of strike coming out of the Middle East, especially from that one coming out from Iran. And I think the third and most important is to have a president with the right attitude with regards to who Putin is. The reset was a mistake because it was based on a premise that the reason why Russia was headed in the direction it was headed under Putin, even when he was behind the curtain, no longer president at the time, was because somehow they didn't like George Bush or they didn't like our foreign policy. That's just not the case. What was happening with Russia was as a result of a Russian Putin foreign policy that argues that any nation that was a former Soviet republic is in his sphere of influence, and that those nations must ask for permission before they are allowed to engage in any sort of alliance with the West. And that's just impermissible. We will never accept a sphere of influence foreign policy, a sphere of influence state of affairs in Europe, and we need to confront that forcefully. And so it's important for us to have a president that understands that the friction that exists between Vladimir Putin are of his making, and that the friction that exists is not personality-based. It is a very calculated effort on his part to try to elevate Russia into great global power status on par with that of the United States.
You mentioned Iran just now in your comments, and we've seen just recently Tehran conducting illegal ballistic missile tests. We just saw in the last week U.S. sailors captured, forced on their knees, with their hands behind their backs, or behind their heads. Chairman Rogers asks, Iran is going to be receiving now billions in sanctions relief because of the deal the U.S. struck with Tehran. What would you be doing differently? What would you do with that deal, and what would you be doing differently if you were in the White House?
Well, I've already made very clear that on my first day in office, I will cancel the deal with Iran. It is not procedurally difficult to do. The deal with Iran is not a treaty. It's not a binding legal document. It is nothing more than the president's willingness to use a national security waiver that exists in the current law to waive existing sanctions. We will reimpose those sanctions. In fact, I believe Iran is eligible for additional sanctions, given their continuing violation of virtually every international norm you can imagine. Second, I believe Iran is going to use these billions of dollars to do what they've always done with it. The sponsorship of Hezbollah, the propping up of Assad, the continuing building up of their conventional military capabilities, particularly towards their aspirations of controlling the Persian Gulf and the Straits of Hormuz. And they're also going to use it to continue to develop the range and accuracy of their long-range missiles. And ultimately, I believe they will use it to either buy or build a nuclear warhead. You don't build long-range missiles unless you're either going to put someone on the moon or you're going to put a nuclear warhead on it. That alone is every indication we need of what their long-term ambitions are. They want to become the dominant regional power in the Middle East, on par with the United States on the world stage in terms of leverage and engagement. And we're not going to allow that to happen. We're certainly not going to allow them access to billions of dollars, which they can use to further that aim.
Let's move a little east from Iran over to China. And what should we be doing? What should the U.S. be doing right now that they're not doing to halt the Chinese hacking and theft when it comes to the U.S.?
Well, first, when it comes to China, the relationship between the United States and China will in many ways define the 21st century. And the cautionary note is that throughout history, anytime you've had a status quo power like America and a rising power like China, throughout history, they've always gone to war. We must avoid that. I don't think the Chinese want that, and we certainly don't want it, and the world wouldn't want it. And the second point I would make is we have no quarrel with the Chinese people. The problem in China is you have a government more interested in the long-term stability of the Chinese Communist Party than they are of China itself. And that's why they're facing some very significant domestic challenges in terms of their economy. Their goal is to become, first of all, I believe ultimately the most powerful nation on earth, but initially to become the dominant power in the Asia-Pacific region and to force us out. In essence, that's the argument they already make to every nation in Asia, is there is a new sheriff in town, a new world order. We are now in charge in Asia. America is a great power, but a great power in decline, and you should stop counting on them for economics or for your security arrangements. And so this is something we need to confront forcefully, which is why rebuilding our Navy is so critical to ensuring that our military and defense commitments in the region aren't just rhetorical. They're actually assets behind it to back it up. When it comes to hacking and cybercrime, I don't know if you saw, I didn't see the full length of it, but 60 Minutes had a pretty extensive expose on it this weekend that highlighted just to what extent we have seen the transfer of intellectual property wealth from the United States to the Chinese government in the last 15 years. It's astonishing. It is the largest threat, it is the largest theft of intellectual property in human history. And they've used it not just to prop up their economy, they have used it to prop up their military as well. One of the first things I will order the Pentagon to do upon taking office is to create a very clear cyber strategy that will make clear to the world, and to China in particular, what the consequences will be for each type of attack. Today, that's not clear. We don't have clear rules of engagement, and we don't have clear rules of response. Nations know what would happen if they attacked us with a missile strike. Nations know what would happen if they tried to invade us. Nations know what would happen if they conducted airstrikes against America, but there is no clear outline for what happens for each type of attack. And as a result, we have an ad hoc policy. We will make very clear what those responses will be. And among them will include the indictment of specific individuals in China responsible for this, the denying access to our markets to any companies in China who are caught using reverse engineered American information. And it will also involve the use of offensive cyber capabilities as a direct deterrent to future attacks on our infrastructure. Of course, last but not least, is we need a significant investment in our cyber defenses. We need to stay ahead of the curve. We don't just need to have the best offensive cyber capability on the planet, but we need to have the best defensive cyber capability. And I think that will take a true partnership between the U.S. government and Silicon Valley, the way the U.S. government worked with manufacturers during the Second World War to turn our industrial capability into the ability to build tanks and airplanes. I think we very much need to partner with the best high-tech industry in the world to create the strongest cyber defenses possible for this country, not just to protect our government infrastructure, but to protect the private infrastructure and the private intellectual property in our country as well.
Well, let me just kind of segue right out of that because we have a question here from Dan Holden in Amherst. And what is the role of the federal government in securing the critical infrastructure that is privately controlled right now?
Well, it's an important role because it is a national security issue. If an enemy of the United States, whether it's a transnational criminal group, a rogue state, radical jihadist group, or a nation state, were able to attack and knock out our power grid, for example, that to me is not simply an act of war, it's a devastating act. And so one that we need to harden our infrastructure against. And so I would say that our role in hardening our infrastructure in this country is no different than our role would be in protecting our borders or in ensuring that we can defend our airspace from any sort of unauthorized intrusion. So, and by the way, it's not just hardening it against cyber attack, it's hardening it against electromagnetic attack and all sorts of other potentially devastating attacks who seem far-fetched and in the world of science fiction, but the truth is these are existing threats that are real. And by the way, an electromagnetic attack or an electromagnetic instance doesn't just have to be from an enemy. It could happen from a solar flare. So we have a vested interest no matter what in hardening our infrastructure, our critical infrastructure in this country. But I think the federal government plays an important role in the basic research necessary to develop the sort of defensive tools we'll need to protect all of our infrastructure, our banking sector, our utility grid, even our traffic lights. I mean, everything. It's really important. Our air traffic control system.
You were here in New Hampshire yesterday. You were at the State House in Concord. And then you had to get back to Washington, D.C. I'm assuming you had a vote on that big bill on the Syrian refugees.
Yes.
We had a question here from the audience on your views on that and where you stand on others in the race have talked about a total temporary ban on Muslims. Where do you stand on the issue?
I think the number one issue in immigration today is keeping ISIS out of America, and for that matter, any radical jihadist group. And that's why when I'm President of the United States, if we do not know who you are for 100% certainty, and we do not know why you are coming for 100% certainty, when I'm President, you're not getting into the country. This is not a religious test, nor is it a regional test. It's very simple. In this day and age, given the threats we now face, we are not going to allow anyone into America whom we do not know who they are. And now, in the realm of the Syrian refugees, it's important to note, it is not that we are anti-refugee. This nation has always accepted refugees, and by the way, will continue to accept refugees from all over the world. The issue specifically with Syrians, however, is there are no accurate databases available for vetting people against. You could run these names against whatever database we have 1,000,000 times, and even if they were a terrorist, they wouldn't turn up. Because there are no databases for terrorists in Syria right now, because perhaps they're recently radicalized. Whatever it may be, we face a very significant threat. We cannot ignore the fact that ISIS has proven to have a sophisticated understanding of the immigration policies of other countries. It is how they have recruited people to go back into Europe. It's how they've potentially recruited people to enter the United States. It's how someone entered the United States on a fiancé visa and passed vetting and background. Of course, that background was not conducted appropriately, and as a result, this individual was able to enter the United States and ultimately participate in the attacks in San Bernardino. So yes, our policies towards refugees has changed because the world has changed, because the threat has changed. And it's not a religious test. I don't believe in religious tests. It is a simple national security test. If we don't know who you are and we don't know why you're coming, when I'm president, you're not getting into America.
Got a question here, and I think I may get the last name wrong. Mark Stull, I believe, from Bedford, New Hampshire. The Army is being reduced to just 400,000 personnel, full-time personnel. At the same time, the DoD civilian employment is over 800,000 and growing. Do you think this adversely impacts our military preparedness, and what would you do about it if you were president?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, we are on pace to soon have the smallest Army since the end of the Second World War, the smallest Navy in 100 years, and the smallest Air Force with the oldest airplanes we have ever had in our history. It cannot be that in a world where North Korea has nuclear weapons and are governed by a lunatic, where China has become increasingly aggressive, where Vladimir Putin has become increasingly aggressive, where Iran is about to access over $100 billion of sanctions relief for their own nuclear ambitions, and where a radical jihadist group like ISIS is now the best organized, best funded, and most capable terrorist group in human history. It cannot be that in the face of all of these threats, the United States is reducing its defense capabilities. The reason why it's happening is simple. We are not spending enough on national security. And that's why I have repeatedly advocated that we get back to the Gates budget baseline of 2012 that will allow us at a minimum to have a force posture necessary to deal with the threats we have before us. I do think that there's ways to reform, for example, our procurement process. I don't think the Defense Department does a great job of spending its money. I do think that our civilian workforce has grown too large in the Defense Department in comparison to the uniformed forces. But we cannot have a commander-in-chief, as some other candidates in this race have proposed, that believes we should spend even less on the military than we're spending now. National security spending is the most important thing the federal government does. And national security spending is not the reason why we have a national debt. When I am president, we are going to restore our military, and it will remain the strongest and most powerful in the world, because as I said at the outset, the world is a safer and a better place when America is the strongest and most capable military in the world.
Well, related to that is a question that asks, how can you be fiscally conservative and spend this money for the military? How do you balance it?
Well, first of all, it's the first thing we should spend money on. That would be like asking the New England Patriots, why are you spending all this money on players and helmets? Why don't you spend it on bleachers and concession stands?
Now, you're a Dolphins fan?
Yeah. Any NFL team, for that matter.
All right.
I'm being regional with you guys, yeah.
All right.
But yes, I'm a Dolphin fan.
It's okay.
Okay? That's why you're laughing, you know. We've had a tough run of it. But it cannot be that we continue to do this. It's the most important thing the federal government does. Before you have a Department of Education, before you have anything, you fully fund national security, not waste money. I'm not saying you just throw money at the problem. Every dollar that's being wasted in the Defense Department is a dollar that's not defending you. I'm not talking about wasting money. I am saying that before you fund anything, you fully fund our national security. Because this nation's national security extends well beyond simply the continental United States. We have economic and national security interests in virtually every corner of this planet. We have to have a military capable of responding to threats in the Asia-Pacific region, potentially in Northern Africa, even in the Western Hemisphere, most certainly in Europe now with Vladimir Putin, and of course the defense of the homeland. These are very significant threats. No other nation faces what we face. We are the #1 target of every rogue element on this planet. They all view us as enemy #1. Whether we like it or not, even if we're nice to them, they're still going to hate us. So we have to be ready and capable of defending ourselves. That's why national security is the first thing we should spend our money on. Number 2, national security spending is not the driver of our debt. The driver of our debt is the current structure of Medicaid and Social Security for future generations. For me, for my children, the way it's structured leaves us with trillions of dollars in unfunded liabilities. So that's why I'm such a supporter of reforming those programs. I want to reform them in a way that leaves them undisturbed for anybody who's on it now, like my mother, or anyone who's about to retire. But those programs will look different for me and for my children. They will still be the best programs in the world. And the changes I propose are not unreasonable. Instead of retiring at 67, I'll have to retire at 68. If I've made a lot of money, my Social Security benefits are not going to grow as fast as someone who made less money. That's not too much to ask of my generation after everything our parents and our grandparents did for us. And if we do that, we can help bring our debt under control. We can save Social Security and Medicare for future generations. We don't have to disrupt it for current beneficiaries or people about to retire, and we'll have the funds necessary to protect our country.
We've been talking a lot about military spending the last couple of minutes. Tate Kurt of Concord, New Hampshire asks, military action, of course, is an essential component of our U.S. foreign policy, but how would you as president consider and how would you use diplomacy and development in your operating philosophy?
Well, ideally, you would be able to solve every problem through diplomacy. And there are problems in the world that can be solved through diplomacy. And there are problems that cannot. There is no diplomatic solution to ISIS because they have no diplomats. There is no ISIS ambassador to America or ISIS ambassador to anyone for that matter. There is no diplomatic solution to ISIS. And so that's the first thing is, obviously, all else has failed. Is it in the national security interest of the United States to engage in this conflict? Second, have you given a clear rule of engagement? Have you defined victory? Don't get engaged in something in which you have not defined what victory is. Third, have you provided the resources necessary to achieve victory? In essence, do they have enough manpower, enough weapons, and the rules of engagement necessary to achieve the outcome you've given them? Fourth, to the extent possible, you must rally the American people, especially through Congress, behind you. Our actions are stronger when we have the support of the American people behind whatever it is we're doing. And fifth, when they come home, we're going to take care of our veterans after they've served us. We're not doing that now. All 5 of these conditions would have to be met. I would ultimately say that the best way to describe it is I advocate the use of war in the defense of peace. When we use force, it is because we are trying to address an enemy of peace. ISIS is an enemy of peace, and that is why they must be defeated. There is no arrangement. There is no coordination with them. Either they win or we win. That is perhaps the clearest example of where our use of force is necessary, and we're going to define what victory is. Victory is their elimination from the battlefield. And now, what will it take to achieve that? It will take additional airstrikes and special operators from the United States, but it will primarily take our ability as the leader of the free world to put together a coalition led primarily by ground forces made up of Sunni Arabs to defeat them militarily and reject them ideologically. None of this will happen without American leadership. When I'm president, we will have a real war on terror, which means we are going to find the best intelligence agencies in the world are going to tell us who the terrorists are and where they are. The best military in the world is going to destroy them. And if we capture any of them alive, they're going to get a one-way ticket to Guantanamo, where we're going to find out everything they know.
Well, you just mentioned Guantanamo Bay, so let me ask this question. The current president, obviously President Obama, has tried for years to close the facility. The question asks, if the Gitmo detainees are released, will you fight to keep Guantanamo Bay open and keep it in U.S. hands?
Well, first, there's Guantanamo Bay is a naval installation. We're keeping it. And that's never going back to the Cuban government. Number two, the Guantanamo Bay prison is going to remain open because we're going to be sending people there that we capture in the battlefield, particularly ISIS. Barack Obama can't close it, but Congress won't let him close it, but he's emptying it. And the bottom line is that a significant percentage of the people released from Guantanamo have rejoined the fight against America. We are either in a war or we are not. I believe we are in a war. This president doesn't want to couch it in those terms. We are in a war against radical Islamic terror. And it's the leader of global jihad right now is ISIS. They have supplanted al-Qaeda as the leader of global ISIS, although al-Qaeda remains a significant threat as well. As long as you are in war, when you get your hands on an enemy combatant alive, you must detain them until the end of those hostilities. That is what we have always done in the conduct of war. And the reason why is because if you release them, you'll rejoin the battlefield against you. That is why prisoners of war are held until the end of a conflict. Now, if the conflict happens to last 100 years, that's what they've chosen, not what we have chosen. But when you are releasing these people, they are rejoining the battlefield against America. Some of the people that have been released are highly capable of people. In fact, al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, was once in U.S. detention in Iraq, from where he became even further radicalized and made the connections with former Saddam Hussein military officials who now serve as the top brass in the ISIS military wing. So again, if you want to see an example of people being released and rejoining the battlefield, al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, who claims to be a caliph and the head of that caliphate, was once in a jail in Iraq that was run by the Americans and coalition forces. Today, he is the leader of this radical group. This is one example, a very stark example, of what happens when you release enemy combatants. They rejoin the fight against America.
Let's move right over the border from Iraq to Syria. And this question asks the Syrian refugee crisis. We've talked about this. How would you address Assad to prevent further human rights abuses in Syria?
Well, just understand that as long as Assad remains in power, there will always be something like ISIS. Assad is an Alawi, and he has been brutal against the Sunni. In fact, it's important to remember that the civil war in Syria did not begin as a civil war. The civil war in Syria began when Syrians, Sunnis primarily, took to the streets in protest against the abuses of the Alawi government. And Assad responded by bombing people. These were civilians. They had not taken up arms yet. He began by bombing them. So what do people do when you bomb them? They either leave, they die, they leave, or they take up arms to defend themselves. And that is how the civil war in Syria began. I warned at the time, if we do not find people among this resistance who we can work with, who are not Islamists, and empower them, it is going to create a vacuum. And that vacuum is going to be filled by radical jihadists. And that's exactly what's happened. In fact, ISIS is a movement that comes out of Iraq, not out of Syria. It is primarily run by foreigners, not by Syrians. Primarily by Iraqis in their top brass, not Syrians. They came into Syria and took advantage of the vacuum created by the civil war. As long as Assad is in power, after you have killed 250,000 people, there is no way that these people are just going to roll over now and allow themselves to be governed by someone like that. So even if you defeat ISIS, as long as Assad is in power, some other group will pop up and serve the same function. It could be Jabhat al-Nusra. It could be some new entity. But something will emerge against Assad, and it will largely be governed by radical jihadists unless we take steps to prevent it. So ultimately, that's why Assad must go. He cannot remain in power because he is an irritant in that region that will lead to a future radical Sunni movement in opposition to him.
Let's move to another hot spot that hasn't gotten as much attention lately, and that's the Horn of Africa, West Africa. As Commander-in-Chief, how would you assist our allies in the region in dealing with Boko Haram and some of the other terrorist groups that are making
Well, interestingly, most of these groups, including Boko Haram, have now pledged their allegiance to ISIS. So when the president says that ISIS is just a bunch of guys on the back of a pickup truck, he's not being truthful. ISIS now has affiliates in over a dozen countries, capable affiliates, who have pledged their allegiance to ISIS and are part of a broader network, including in Libya, where they now have not become a very predominant group, in Darna and Sirte and other places, which they're using as an operational base to destabilize Egypt, conduct attacks in the Sinai, and project power eventually across the Mediterranean and into Europe. So these groups have to be dealt with in the context of what's happening with ISIS. I do think we need to empower coalition partners from NATO, but also those countries in particular with the resources necessary to confront these terrorist groups and defeat them. I would warn that ISIS is no longer simply contained to the Middle East and Africa. They now have shown the capability to strike in Indonesia. I think the Philippines bears watching, believe it or not. I think India and Pakistan is a place where they've begun to emerge as well. In Afghanistan, there is an open competition between the Taliban and ISIS to become the predominant Sunni movement in that country. So ISIS is spreading. Even as its core in Iraq and Syria faces some setbacks, it is continuing to spread its reach across the world and in different parts of the world. So these groups need to be confronted in the broader context of ISIS. I do believe that if you can eliminate the core of ISIS in Iraq and Syria, it diminishes, these groups will still be around because they pre-existed ISIS, but it will take away a lot of the material support that they now receive.
You just mentioned NATO, so let's bounce back to Europe and talk about the defense shield, the missile shield, which is now operational in Romania, and Poland's going to have it in a couple of years. The question asks, would you support a NATO consolidated fleet in the Black Sea?
Yes, and in fact, the U.S. needs to be a greater participant in both in that endeavor, and the reason why is, well, we've understood the reason why, but the reason why this is important, it goes back to the context of what I talked about with the Navy. The pushback from the Navy, and I saw some of its senior commanders a couple weeks ago, basically, without naming me, respond to some of my criticisms is, yes, we have less ships, but our ships are more technologically capable than ever, and so we don't need as many ships. And I will concede that our ships are more technologically capable. Here's what they still can't do, be two places at once. No matter how technologically capable they are, you cannot have an aircraft carrier in the Pacific and in the Mediterranean at the exact same time. And so that's why we need to expand our naval capabilities. And so that includes the ability to project power into the Black Sea, into the Mediterranean, into Asia. We still have a significant presence necessary in the Western Hemisphere, particularly for drug interdiction, and of course in the Pacific area to live up to our defense commitments. I do think it's promising, for example, in the Asia-Pacific region, that Japan has taken steps, politically difficult steps, to allow them to provide common defense, which means up to now, Japan is only able to respond if they are directly attacked. If a U.S. naval vessel comes under attack, under their constitution, Japan was not allowed to come to our defense. Now, based on their new rulings and the new decision by Abe, they are able to provide collective self-defense. This is important because Japan is a capable naval power. They don't get a lot of attention. People view them as a self-defense force. But Japan has one of the most capable navies in the world, and they are a very significant force multiplier for the defense of that region, particularly against North Korean aggression.
And a larger U.S. Navy means keeping the Portsmouth Naval Yard open?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
We have
Shipyard, yes.
But it's not just keeping it open because I'm in New Hampshire. We can't lose our capability. It's very when you take down both manufacturing and maintenance capabilities, you can't just flip the switch and start it up again when you want to. You lose workforce, you lose expertise. It's what we've seen in the space program. You have these highly qualified individuals who worked on the space shuttle program. When the space shuttle ended, there was no work for them to do. They're not going to sit around for 10 years until someone figures out we want to build a replacement to the shuttle. They migrate to other lines of work, and then you lose that capacity, that domestic capacity to provide these services. I think it's also important for us to have that East Coast capacity for the United States.
Another question about ISIS from Mark Stewart. He asks, why can't we call ISIS murderers instead of soldiers?
Well, I do. I mean, ISIS is a group that participates in genocide. ISIS has state-like elements to it, but they're really not a state. They want to be considered one, but they're not. But they have state-like elements. They are basically the most powerfully armed insurgency terrorist group in history, and they need to be confronted as such. But ISIS is a murderous group. Their practices are abhorrent, and I think we have to constantly remind ourselves of who we are dealing with here. We are dealing with people who take girls as young as 9 and 10 years of age and sell them off as brides. They auction women off as brides. Particularly Yazidi women have faced this, but others as well. This is outrageous. They are selling them off as prizes or giving them away as prizes to their fighters. This is who we're dealing with. We're dealing with a group that summarily beheads anyone who is not a radical Sunni. They consider everyone who's not like them to be a heretic. Most certainly Yazidis, but Christians and Jews and Shia and other Sunnis that don't agree with their interpretations of the Quran. And they summarily execute people. And that is not the only thing they do. The torture they submit people to, what they're doing with young girls and women, the burning of people alive in cages, all of these sorts of things they participate in. This is who we're dealing with here. We need to confront them for who they are, a genocidal group.
Let's talk about something that has not come up yet, but it's an important issue. And Patrick from Durham asks, how do we balance our need for mass intelligence gathering with American civil liberties and freedoms?
They're not in conflict. Number one, American spy agencies should not spy on Americans that are not terrorists or foreign agents. And in fact, every second they spend spying on one of you is a second they're not using it to look at somebody else. And by the way, I think a lot of the things you've read out there in the press are not accurate. U.S. intelligence agencies are not tracking everyday Americans. These are some of the most patriotic people that serve in our government. They are not sitting around all day trying to find out stuff about you. And if they do, it's against the law. They should be fired and prosecuted. If anybody in the U.S. intelligence community is caught spying against you, they should be fired and prosecuted because that is a federal crime. That said, I want you to know something. Your local supermarkets and retailers know more about you than the U.S. government intelligence agencies do. They know a lot more. They know what magazines you subscribe to. They know what you buy every time you go to the store. And the consumer information available on all Americans is much broader than anything the federal government is trying to spy on you on. Here's what we know for a fact, and this is the truth. There are people in the United States right now, even as I speak to you, who are American citizens, born and raised in this country, who have benefited from all the largesse and blessings of America, who are loyal to ISIS, and if given the opportunity, want to strike against America, whether it is part of an organized plot or one that they were inspired to take action. We better have the tools available to find them before they conduct these strikes. We better find out who they are and stop this. And that's just on the terrorism side. On the foreign policy side, everybody spies against America. North Korea, Cuba, a third, fourth-rate power, spies against America quite aggressively and sells our information. Right now, even as we speak, they've probably reversed engineered Sidewinder missiles that wound up in Cuba by mistake and are giving it to the Russians and to the Chinese. The Russians and the Chinese have electronic eavesdropping listening stations in Cuba. The Russians are in a city called Lourdes, the Chinese are in a city called Bejucal, and these are listening stations that they use to spy on NASA, Southern Command, Central Command, Special Operation Command that are all headquartered in Florida. The Russians very aggressively collect against America. The Chinese, you can just imagine, they very aggressively collect against America. By the way, that's why what Hillary Clinton did with her server is so outrageous. She must have known that that was very vulnerable to foreign defense services. So we cannot erode our intelligence capabilities because someone's making outrageous claims out there. It is against the law to spy against Americans if they're not terrorists. But I am telling you, when I am President of the United States, whether you were born in this country or not, if you are loyal to ISIS, we are going to find out about you. And we're going to find out who you are and where you are before you kill an American. Before you're the guy in Philadelphia who fired 3 shots into a police car 2 weeks ago because he was inspired by ISIS to do it. Before you conduct an attack in San Bernardino. We won't be able to prevent all of them. And I'm not claiming that these 2 attacks could have been prevented by intelligence information because homegrown violent extremists are the hardest type of extremists to find. I am saying to you that if there is a tool out there that would help us prevent terrorist attacks, we can use it without violating the civil liberties of Americans. And when I'm president, we will.
This past summer, a lot of news about the American out in San Francisco that was killed by an illegal immigrant, somebody who had been deported 5 times. Corey from Manchester asked, what would you do as president to make sure that something like that does not happen again?
Well, first of all, sanctuary cities like San Francisco would lose their federal law enforcement money. Any city who's out there bragging, almost recruiting people to move there because we don't enforce immigration laws, should not be receiving federal law enforcement money. They're flaunting federal law. Second, criminal aliens are going to be deported when I'm president. And if they come back into the United States, they're going to face very stiff penalties. That's why I support Kate's law. Third, we are going to enforce our immigration laws. And we know what it takes to enforce our immigration laws. People act like this is some great mystery. The other argument I hear is, oh, it's already as secure as it's ever going to be. That is a lie. That is not true. Okay, we need at least 20,000 new border agents if we truly want to enforce our immigration laws. We need to finish the 700 miles of fencing and walls that are required. We need more technology on key sectors of the southern border where not only are people being trafficked, but drugs like heroin are being trafficked, often destined for right here in New Hampshire. We also need a mandatory E-Verify system to shut off the job magnet that's driving people to the United States. We need a biometric entry-exit tracking system to prevent visa overstays. 40% of the illegal immigrants in America entered legally and overstayed a visa. We do these things, you will see illegal immigration plummet. And then when people that are here illegally, we're going to deal with that very reasonably, but we're not going to have amnesty. I do not support amnesty, and I never have. I believe that there has to be very significant consequences for having violated our immigration laws. And in particular, if you are a criminal alien, you will be deported from the United States when I'm president. Not hanging around in San Francisco waiting to murder someone like what we saw happen just a year ago.
Let's switch gears here. If elected president, how would you deal with the transatlantic relationship? Would you end the pivot to Asia? Would you put more emphasis back on Europe?
No, I think, again, that's why America's America. We can't make those kinds of choices. We've got to be in both. We have to be able to do both. And we've always done both. But today, the threats are different, and we've got to be able to do both. First of all, the pivot to Asia is a rhetorical pivot. The reality of it is that there are months out of the year where there is no aircraft carrier in the Pacific area from the United States. That's why we need to rebuild our military. So our pivot cannot simply be a rhetorical pivot. It has to be a military pivot, a diplomatic pivot, and an economic pivot as well. Because we are a Pacific power. The Pacific is not some faraway area that we want to be involved in. We are in the Pacific. We face the Pacific. We have a state in the Pacific. And we have very strong and important economic and military alliances in the Pacific. South Korea, the Philippines, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. These are important American allies in the region for whom we have a strong partnership with. So we have to be able to do that without abandoning our transatlantic relationship in Europe. And the transatlantic relationship is critical, especially in light of the increased Russian aggression that we now see. We will never accept, when I am president, any sort of arrangement in which Vladimir Putin is allowed to have spheres of influence that he governs. We will never accept the idea that because you were once a former Soviet republic, or for that matter, a Warsaw Pact member, that somehow you have to ask Russia's permission before you do a trade deal with us, or before you join NATO, or before you do joint exercises with the U.S. military. So the bottom line is, one of the reasons why we need to rebuild our military is because we can't choose between the Atlantic and the Pacific. We have to do both.
Related to that, question here about the South China Sea. Would you send the U.S. Pacific Fleet in there?
Absolutely. These are international waters, and the territorial claims that China are making in the South China Sea are illegitimate. And we will sail the U.S. Navy and fly our airplanes through there consistently. We will keep the shipping lanes open. The South China Sea is not some obscure body of water. The South China Sea is the most important shipping lane in the world. 40% of global commerce goes through the South China Sea. It is very likely that there are things in this room that were shipped here through the South China Sea. And the idea that China, by artificially building islands and then claiming the territorial waters around them, could end up creating governance of the South China Sea is simply unacceptable. And so we need to never allow that to be established as a fact, which is what they're trying to do. They are basically trying to establish it as a fact to the point where no one contests it. In essence, it is what it is. We have to accept it. We will never accept it when I'm president. We will sail our merchant ships through there. We will sail our Navy through there. We will fly our airplanes through there. We are never going to agree to the idea that China governs the South China Sea, as they have claimed for a long time now. If you look at a Chinese passport, you will see something called the 9-dash line, which is basically their claims of what they control. It's almost all of Asia. There's no way we're ever going to accept that, ever.
We were talking about Guantanamo Bay a few minutes ago. We've seen dramatic changes in our relationship with Cuba over the last year. You're in the White House. It's a year from now. What do you do with that relationship?
Well, I have no problem with changing our relationship towards Cuba, but Cuba has to change its relationship towards us. And I would never have signed this deal the president made, and I will reverse key elements of it. And I'll tell you why. Number one, Cuba's not a U.S. ally. They're an anti-American communist dictatorship. So a year ago, this is now public, you've read it in newspapers, a freight forwarder mistakenly sent a Sidewinder missile to Cuba. They didn't call us and say, hey, we've got this thing delivered to us, it belongs to you, we want to send it to you right away. They didn't. They held on to it. Now, we don't know for sure what they did. We can only speculate. But I think it's an educated guess to say they probably took all the data that's on there and all the technology that's on there and gave it right over to the Chinese and to the Russians and to others potentially. Number two, Cuba was caught just 2 years ago helping North Korea evade sanctions. Basically, in a container full of sugar, they buried all kinds of parts for missiles and for MiGs. And nothing happened, by the way. This is in violation of UN sanctions. No big deal. Number three, Cuba today harbors fugitives of American justice. So, for example, Joanne Chesmar is a killer and a murderer who killed a New Jersey state trooper in the 1970s. She went to jail, she escaped, and went to Cuba. She's been living there under the protection of the Cuban government ever since. Number four, Cuba hosts dozens of Medicare fraudsters, basically people that took advantage of our generosity and came to the United States. They opened up a fake pharmacy or a fake clinic. They billed Medicare for millions of dollars. They stole your money, and they went back to Cuba and are living high on the hog on your money. Number four. Number five, Cuba hosts these listening stations. Number six, that I told you about, the Chinese and the Russians. Number six, Cuba oppresses its people so badly that today we have a migratory crisis from Cuba that's being underreported. You literally have thousands of Cuban migrants who have gone to Costa Rica and are now working their way up Central America to cross the U.S. border because once they come into the United States, they're legal under the Cuban Adjustment Act. Okay? That is the consequences of having a dictatorship 90 miles from our shores. They continue to send thousands and thousands and thousands of migrants toward the United States as a result of that. So in the face of all this, this president basically made major concessions towards Cuba. You know what Cuba changed? Nothing. The only thing Cuba did was release 53 political prisoners, of whom the majority have since gone back to jail. So they've done nothing. This is what kind of one-sided deal is this? No wonder why people around the world laugh at Barack Obama. By the way, we also traded 3 Cuban spies convicted in federal court of turning over secrets to the Cubans that allowed the Cubans to kill Americans. Because there was unarmed pilots on a civilian airplane flying over the Straits of Florida trying to spot rafters to save their lives by calling in the Coast Guard, and 2 Cuban MiGs shot them down. There were American citizens on those planes. Those spies are the ones that provided the information to the Cubans that allowed them to shoot down those planes because they knew when they were going to fly, who was flying, and where they were flying. And we released these people in exchange for an American hostage. Alan Gross was an American hostage, an American who went to Cuba to hand out radios to the small Jewish community that remains there. And they took him to jail, almost killed him in captivity because of how they treated him. So, of course, people are now trying to get a hold of Americans all over the world. They know they can make a trade with Obama on it. So, this is absurd. On the other hand, with Burma, it's not perfect. But with Burma, the United States recognized Burma diplomatically in exchange for changes in Burma. Today, the minority party in Burma now governs the parliament there. At least something happened there. Cuba changed nothing. So this is absurd. These are the kinds of trades that don't just involve Cuba. They send a message to the world that America has a weak president. Let's take advantage of him. And they're taking advantage of us. Other than that, I guess it's fine. I mean,
Okay. We've been talking for over half an hour, and we haven't brought up Israel. So I'm glad that Ann from Portsmouth asks, what would you do to address the U.S., Washington's eroding relationship with Israel, with the leadership there in Jerusalem? And what would you do about the Palestinian crisis if you were president?
well, first of all, I think my election alone would improve relationships with Israel because that means there's a new president and someone with a strong pro-Israel record. It's interesting, when people talk to me about Israel, there's almost this implied idea. Well, let me back up. Barack Obama has undermined our relationship with Israel because he and Hillary Clinton bought into this idea that the way to improve our standing in the Islamic world was to create some separation from Israel. They bought into this notion that the reason why we had such bad relationships with some in the Islamic world is because we were too close to Israel. So let's create some space between us. And you see that in their foreign policy they've conducted. That's very dangerous because Israel is surrounded by enemies on every corner. And any sort of separation between the U.S. and Israel invites aggression against Israel. So the first thing is my election will reverse that sort of attitude. Israel is the only pro-American, free enterprise democracy in the Middle East, and we will be a strong supporter of Israel. In fact, I have already said that my first trip abroad when I am president will be taking Air Force One to Tel Aviv and visiting the leadership in Jerusalem. And by the way, moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Israel is the only country in the world who is told what their capital is. The capital of Israel is Jerusalem, and that's where our embassy should be. And that's where I'll be meeting with their leaders on my first foreign trip. Number two, Israel, what does Israel ask of America? They don't ask us to invade any countries. Israel hasn't asked us to station American troops in Israel. All they've asked is, if we get into a war and we run out of weapons, or we run out of bullets, or we run out of rockets, resupply us. We'll pay you for it. When I'm president, we will keep that promise. And the other thing they ask is, in international forums, when nations try to delegitimize us, as the UN does now as a ritual by habit, they've sanctioned Israel more than anyone else, more than North Korea, more than anyone else. They're constantly criticizing Israel. Use your veto power to stop it. When I'm president, we will do that. This president has left that in doubt. The issue of the Palestinians. I don't know of any nation on earth that wants an answer to that more than Israel does. Here's the fact. A deal today is not possible, because there's no one for Israel to negotiate with. Over the last 10 years, Israel has made some very, very generous offers to the Palestinian leadership, and those offers have been rejected. It is very difficult to deal with a group who teaches their children that killing Jews is glorious. It is very difficult to cut a deal with a group that is spreading false rumors about what's happening on the Temple Mount. They're going around basically saying that they're going to tear down the dome, and everyone knows that's not true. And so now you've got people out there stabbing people. Stabbings, and then you've got the Palestinian leadership celebrating these sorts of things. They've got entire monuments built for the martyrs, which really are terrorists that have killed Jews and Israelis throughout the last few years. How are you going to negotiate a deal with people like this? I feel bad for the Palestinian people. They have terrible leadership. These people that are governing there now are not good leaders. They are not good leaders. And as a result, they are destabilizing that part of the world. So at this point, I don't see the conditions for a deal. And pressuring Israel into a deal that makes them less safe is not what an ally does. And I would refer you to a report in the Washington Free Beacon about 2 weeks ago, in which one of these emails on Hillary Clinton's server was a suggestion from one of her senior advisors that somehow the U.S. should conduct a covert operation to foment protests in the Palestinian areas, to force Israel to the negotiating table. Now, she didn't respond. All she responded was, please print this for me. If someone who works for me suggested that, I would fire them. I would fire them. When I am president of the United States, we are going to be on Israel's side. They are the only pro-American, free enterprise democracy in the Middle East, and we are going to stand firmly on their side when I'm president.
Well, Senator Rubio, on behalf of Americans for Peace, Prosperity, and Security, UNH Manchester, and NH1 News on WBIN TV, we want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.